The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel. In 1976, in Germany, in the small town of Klingenberg, a student of pedagogy, Anneliese Michel, died during an exorcism. She was a perfectly normal, healthy, and very religious person. But her problems began in 1968. It was then that she began to experience strange attacks, brief fainting, body stiffness, and a terrifying feeling of suffocation and crushing. Over time, her condition worsened. She became more and more depressed and started to see devilish faces, again and again. Doctors suspected epilepsy and prescribed treatments to prevent seizures. But the attacks continued to escalate. Eventually, her parents began to suspect possession, so they took the girl on a pilgrimage to San Damiano, a place famous for Mary's apparitions. During the pilgrimage, the girl acted very strangely. She felt a great disgust for holy objects, unable to enter the church or even look at holy pictures. She tore at medallions and rosaries. She spoke foul, blasphemous words. Soon a terrible smell began to emerge around her, one that couldn't be ventilated in any way. For many years, Anneliese was subjected to detailed medical examinations by various doctors, but they couldn't agree on a diagnosis. Mental illness was suspected, as well as brain damage and epilepsy. Powerful medications were prescribed, but since treatment failed, some doctors suggested there is no cure for the devil. Anneliese's parents finally turned to the church for help. At first, the priests simply watched her. They gave her the usual blessings, which brought some relief, but only temporarily. Her condition, however, continued to deteriorate. In the end, it was decided to conduct a trial exorcism. This exorcism is performed mentally, and the person is not told about it. Its purpose, to determine if it was truly a case of possession. During the trial exorcism, Anneliese reacted violently. She went mad, screaming, tearing at her rosary. In September 1975, the bishop gave permission to begin the real exorcisms. They lasted for a year and were recorded on audio tapes, as Anneliese had requested. During the exorcisms, the demons revealed themselves, 6 of them. They called themselves Lucifer, Judas, Cain, Nero, Hitler, and the fallen priest Fleischmann. Anneliese suffered enormously. She roared, growled, and cursed the priests. Her face became twisted and deformed. She gnawed her teeth, her body contorted unnaturally. She spoke in a thick, male voice and in unfamiliar languages. During these exorcisms, Anneliese also received visions of saints, angels, the Mother of God, and Christ. Stigmata appeared on her body. The Mother of God was asked to release her, but when Mary appeared, the demons went berserk. They didn't want to leave her body, but eventually it seemed like they might. October 31st, 1975 was supposed to be the day of her release, but the demons returned. Why? During one of her visions, Our Lady asked Anneliese if she was willing to suffer as penance for sinners. And Anneliese agreed. She took upon herself the enormous suffering in exchange for the salvation of others. Anneliese said that a change would come in July. But by the end of her life, she was nothing more than a human wreckage. She was emaciated. She hardly ate because the demons wouldn't let her. She was badly mauled. Her face was swollen, bluish. She scratched the walls with her nails, broke glass with her head, and even bit stones from the wall. The devil threw her from wall to wall. She hurt herself terribly, smashing her head, hitting her face until it bled, and making thousands of frantic kneelings. Anneliese believed that, according to Our Lady's promise, in July, she would finally be freed from the demons. But on July 1st, 1976, she died. Her parents and the priests were accused of causing her death. The media had already declared them guilty before the trial even began. A biased judge threw out critical evidence, and partial witnesses were called. In the end, the parents and the exorcists were found guilty and sentenced to a 2-year suspended sentence. Later, an American cultural anthropologist, Professor Felicitas Goodman, investigated the case. After 15 years of studying so-called religious emergencies and analyzing the audio tapes of Anneliese's exorcisms, she came to a surprising conclusion. Anneliese Michel was truly possessed. Her death was not the fault of the exorcists or her parents, but rather the result of poisoning from anti-epileptic drugs. The exorcism of Erling is not as famous as that of Anneliese Michel, but it is just as terrifying. This exorcism inspired the movie The Exorcism of Anna Eklund, but the name of the protagonist of the real story is unknown. For convenience, I'll call her Anna anyway. The girl in question had been possessed by the devil at the age of 14, following a curse that her father put on her after she refused to engage in an incestuous relationship with him. After a first exorcism was successful, her father's lover, who practiced black magic, cursed her again, ensuring that Satan took possession of Anna once more. Anna was a girl living in the United States. Born in 1882, she attended only primary school and was a very religious girl who often went to church and received the Eucharist. As a teenager, Anna had to deal with the depraved advances of her father, who wanted to force an incestuous relationship on her, but Anna resisted. She continued her life in religious morality. However, after her 14th birthday, something began to change. She started to feel a bad feeling when entering the church, sometimes feeling the urge to break the holy water fonts and act on terrible sexual impulses that threatened her virginity. At first, she managed to hold off these strange feelings, but soon, they took over. She became violent and thought she'd gone mad. In the following years, her mother took her to various doctors and specialists, fearing her daughter was insane. But, to their amazement, every doctor said Anna was perfectly healthy. Not knowing where else to turn, and with the symptoms worsening, Anna's mother turned to the church. Reverend Theophilus Riesinger, a Capuchin monk of German origin and an experienced exorcist, was called in to observe her case. After some time, he concluded that Anna was indeed possessed. In 1912, he performed an exorcism that gave the desired result. Anna was free from the demon that possessed her. But, unfortunately, this peace wouldn't last. Anna's father's mistress, Mina, who practiced black magic, cursed some herbs and put them in Anna's food, causing a second demonic possession. The Bible warns, if a demon is cast out, it will return with 7 other demons more evil than him. Reverend Theophilus was called again. After further study of Anna's case, he decided to carry out a second exorcism. Anna was brought to Erling, to an isolated monastery, in order to attract as little attention as possible. Father Theophilus even stated that Anna's real name would not be revealed to protect her identity. On August 18, 1928, the exorcism began. Anna was brought into the convent and immediately proved hostile toward anything sacred or blessed. She could even distinguish between a blessed object and a normal one. She was bound to the bed to prevent her from hurting herself or others, with nuns holding her steady. Father Theophilus had only just begun the initial prayers when Anna fell into a state of unconsciousness that lasted through the ritual. As soon as the priest pronounced the exorcism formula, Anna broke free from the nun's grip, leapt up, and her body landed on a wall above the door, stuck to the wall, supported by a supernatural force. The onlookers struggled to drag her down, finally getting her back to the bed. But the priest's prayers continued, and Satan began to speak through poor Anna. The sounds coming from her were not human. They were animal-like, like a crazed herd, and they were so loud that local farmers began to hear them. As the exorcism continued, crowds gathered at the convent, curious about the inhuman noises. But once they realized it was an exorcism, many fled in terror. Inside, the nuns couldn't bear it either. They had to take turns, unable to stay in Anna's room for too long. Father Theophilus, however, remained calm as he was accustomed to exorcisms. Things got worse as the prayers intensified. The demons made Anna vomit, urinate, and expel excrement from her body multiple times a day, filling buckets. She even vomited tobacco leaves. The stench was nauseating. The grunts continued, and staying in Anna's room became impossible. During the exorcism, the priest was able to speak with the demons inside Anna. Among them was Judas Iscariot, who had tried to push her to madness and suicide. It was then that the priest discovered the true cause of Anna's possession. It was the lost souls of her father and his concubine haunting her and compelling her into this cursed state. As days passed, Anna's body swelled and deformed. At one point, her body became so bloated and shapeless that the nuns turned away in fear, worried she might explode. Anna grew increasingly heavy, her weight causing the bed rails to bend. She became rigid, like concrete. The exorcism lasted a total of 23 days, performed on 3 occasions from August to December 1928, allowing Anna's body and the sisters to recuperate. Finally, Anna was freed from the demons that tormented her. Her case became famous, spread by word of mouth from the peasants who had heard her inhuman screams. The Exorcism of Margaret. The night was unnaturally quiet in the village, save for the distant rustling of leaves under the chilling wind. In the months since the war had ended, peace should have come. But darkness still loomed over the village as though some ancient shadow had never left. The narrow roads were empty. The villagers hid behind locked doors, muttering prayers under their breath. A sense of dread permeated the air, thick and oppressive. Father Patrick O'Connor, a weary priest returning from years spent on war-torn battlefields, approached a small stone cottage at the edge of town. The letter that had drawn him here had been vague, almost cryptic. The request had come from an old colleague, Father Sullivan, whose voice in the brief note had been almost unrecognizable in its desperation. There had been no mention of specifics, just a plea for help. "Come at once, there is an evil here beyond our control." As he approached the house, the silence became more pronounced, pressing in on him like a physical weight. The cottage itself looked ordinary enough, but a palpable sense of unease radiated from it. The wind seemed to die as he neared, as though it too feared what lay inside. The door creaked open without resistance, revealing a house thick with shadows. Inside, the air was frigid, carrying a stench of decay that clawed at his senses. The place seemed suspended in time, forgotten by the world outside. Dust coated the surfaces, and faint trails of soot blackened the walls. At the far end of the small room was a narrow staircase leading upward, where he knew he had to go. He ascended, each step heavier than the last. The dim light from his lantern cast eerie, flickering shadows across the walls, twisting the shapes around him. There was a darkness at the top of the stairs, deeper and more sinister than anything he had encountered before. It clung to the space like a living entity, and as he reached the top, the oppressive air thickened, suffocating him with its unnatural weight. The source of the evil was unmistakable. In the small bedroom, a girl lay strapped to the bed. Her name was Margaret. He remembered that much from the letter. Her body was emaciated, the pallor of death already clinging to her skin. Her limbs were bound tightly with iron chains, a sign of the ferocity she had exhibited in her possession. Around her, the air hummed with an energy that made the hairs on his arms rise. The atmosphere was suffocating. It was as though the room itself was alive with malevolence, watching him, judging him. A single candle flickered on the bedside table, its flame dancing wildly in the cold air, as if attempting to ward off something unseen. Margaret's eyes were closed, but her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. The air around her seemed to pulse, and the room reeked of sulfur, and something else, something darker that clawed at the edges of his mind. The stench of death was unmistakable, and it gnawed at his senses. In the corner of the room, a relic stood, a statue of the Virgin Mary, half shattered and covered in grime. It had fallen at some point, perhaps in one of the girl's violent episodes. The head of the statue lay broken on the floor, eyes cast downward as though in mourning. Even the holy symbols seemed powerless in the face of the evil that had taken root here. Father O'Connor began the rite of exorcism with trembling hands. He had done this before, though never under such circumstances, never with such a foreboding sense that something truly ancient and monstrous awaited him. As he began the prayers, his voice low but resolute, the room seemed to respond. The temperature dropped even further, the candle flickering more wildly. The first signs of movement from Margaret were slight, but unmistakable. Her fingers twitched, and her head began to loll unnaturally to one side. Then her mouth opened, and a guttural sound emerged. Not a scream, but something far worse. A low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the walls like thunder. It was the sound of something inhuman. Her eyes snapped open, and O'Connor felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Her eyes, once blue, were now pools of pitch-black void, reflecting nothing but emptiness. As he continued the ritual, the room began to shift. The shadows grew thicker, crawling across the walls like liquid, bending and contorting as though seeking to escape. The oppressive weight in the air turned suffocating. The darkness moved with purpose, drawn to Margaret, enveloping her in a grotesque display of possession. Suddenly, her body jerked violently, as though pulled by unseen hands. The bed rattled under her, the chains straining against her thrashing limbs. Her mouth contorted into an unnatural grin, stretching far beyond human limits. Without warning, her body lurched upward, levitating a few inches off the bed, her back arched at an impossible angle. The entity within her was fighting back. The guttural growls gave way to words, harsh, guttural, ancient. They scraped against O'Connor's mind, foreign and vile. He had read about such cases, where demons spoke in languages long forgotten by man, but hearing it was a different thing altogether. It clawed at his psyche, threatening to break his will. He continued his prayers, his voice trembling but resolute. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows violently, though there was no storm. Inside, the darkness twisted and writhed around Margaret, as though feeding on her suffering. The air itself seemed to pulse with an evil sentience, filling the space with an unholy presence. Then, without warning, the sound of bones cracking filled the room. Margaret's body twisted further, bending in ways that no human body should. Her face contorted in agony, though no scream escaped her lips. Her head snapped back, and her eyes rolled into her skull. For a moment, the room was silent, and all O'Connor could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The darkness surged forward then, as though driven to desperation by his prayers. It clawed at the light, at the crucifix he held before him. The room itself seemed to shift and warp under the entity's influence, as though reality was slipping away. With one final prayer, O'Connor shouted the words of the exorcism. The air rippled violently, and for a moment, everything stood still. Then the entity let out a roar, a sound so full of hatred and fury that the very foundations of the house seemed to shake. Margaret's body convulsed one last time before collapsing back onto the bed, still and lifeless. The candle flickered, then went out. The silence that followed was deafening, the oppressive darkness finally retreating.